Hey guys, Mr. Ryan here. Chapters 40 to 42. This is like the fourth take. Try this again. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully, but now as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was a wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling out the entire plant, including the root. Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions, Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shores. Miss Gladys Tennyson was just wearing her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Miss Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat, so it was quite surprising to see the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. "Good morning, Miss Tennyson. How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," agreed Miss Tennyson. "No, but not Doc Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on their stomach." "Leeches, my word!" "He said they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how does the leech know the good blood from the bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Miss Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look just lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Miss Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know you're parading around in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you," said Miss Tennyson. "We have been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Miss Tennyson, "but nearly killed Becca. What with her being so young, Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hattie said contritely. "Hey, out of there." Ah. She's ran under the bed. Don't know what she's doing down there. Can you actually get her? She's under the bed. Thanks. Sorry. I'm glad Becca. I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned quickly and walked away. "Tell Becca when she feels up to it she can come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Miss Pennison bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right, then," said Miss Tennyson. "Give my change in onions." Sam gave Miss Tennyson an additional 3 onions. She fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days. So onions worked for her, it probably worked for Zero. Stanley and Zero slept on and off for the next 2 days and ate onions all day they wanted and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed a shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up more mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go down to get the shovel. Actually, right here. Okay. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go down and look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said, as if he had any choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure where he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up toward the top of the mountain. He must walk right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero this far. It would have been impossible for him to carry Zero uphill, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in the weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that shovel could be there, but he'd already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken except the one that had broken earlier. And if they rolled down the hill, it was doubtful they would found the sack and shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb, and he did it the first time with Zero on his back. Chapter 41. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was in a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back at home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into the hole, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled jars and poured the water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad. I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I'd just gone myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they'd found out I didn't have a mom, they would make me a ward of the state. What's a ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Stanley remembered Mr. Pinansky telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew he had become one. I like sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I'd see them park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Cub Scout, said Stanley. I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat. I like the blue uniform, said Zero. Maybe I wouldn't have been like being a Cub Scout. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mother was once a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you said you didn't have a mother. Everybody has to have a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She said she once won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies, said Zero. She was really proud of that. Stanley peeled off another layer of his onion. We always took what we needed. So the onion's a metaphor for Zero. See, like he's peeling layers back of like Zero as a person. Like, you know, you're peeling layers of onion. There's layers to Zero. Anyways, we always took what we needed, Zero said. When I was little, I didn't know I was stealing. I don't remember when I found out, but we just took what we needed, never more. So when I saw the shoes on display in the shelter, I just reached in the glass case and took them. Clyde Livingston's shoes? Asked Stanley. I didn't know they were his. I just thought they were somebody else's shoes. It was better to take somebody else's shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of new ones. I didn't think they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. Then the next thing I know, everybody's making a big deal. Those shoes are missing. It was kind of funny in a way. The whole place is going crazy. There I was wearing the shoes. Everyone's running around saying, what happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone. I just walked out the door. No one noticed me. When I got outside, I ran around the corner and immediately took off the shoes. I put them on top of a parked car, and I remember they smelled really bad. Yeah, those were them, said Stanley. Did they fit you? Pretty much. Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingston's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingston had small, quick feet. Stanley's feet were big and slow. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I'd already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of a shoe store with a pair of new sneakers. If I had just kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither of us would be here right now. Chapter 42. Zero became strong enough to help dig the hole. When he finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to help separate the water from the dirt. He was still the best hole digger around. That's the last hole I will ever dig, he declared, throwing down a shovel. Stanley smiled. He wished it were true, but he knew they only had no choice but eventually to return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. They had completely They had been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial. They followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions. There was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by desert. Zero stared up at Big Thumb. It must have a hole in it, he said, filled with water. You think? Where else could the water be coming from? Zero asked. Water doesn't run uphill. Stanley bit into an onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose. In fact, he no longer particularly noticed a strong taste. So, water runs uphill. Remember, Elia had to bring the pig up to a hill where the water ran uphill. So, things are connecting. He remembered when he first carried Zero up the hill, how the air smelled bitter. It smelled like thousands of onions growing, rotting, and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. How many onions do you think we've eaten? He said. Zero shrugged. I don't even know how long we've been here. I'd say about a week, said Stanley. We've probably eaten about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I bet we really stink. 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake, staring up at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that right before a person freezes to death, he suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that made his life miserable. Before, he'd been unhappy at school, where he had no friends, and bullies like Derek Dunn picked on him. No one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delirious. He looked over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight, and there was a flower petal blowing in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in, and the petal was drawn almost touching his nose. Zero breathed out, and the petal moved away toward his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazingly long time before fluttering off to the side. Stanley considered placing it back on in front of Zero's nose, but it wouldn't be the same. It seemed like Zero had lived in Camp Green Lake forever, but Stanley thought about it now. He realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or two before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered what Zero had said the days before. If Zero had just kept those shoes, then neither of them would be here right now. As Stanley stared up at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he would rather be. He was glad Zero put the shoes on the park card. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit them on the head. When the shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered thinking how destiny had struck him. Now, he thought so again. It was more than a coincidence. It had to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could just make it past the camp, then follow the dirt road back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and 3 jars of water. And he has a canteen as well. They could refill their jars and canteen at the camp, maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselors were still on guards. Everyone has to think they're dead. Buzzard food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell them he was alive, but he couldn't go visiting him in case the police were watching the apartment. Although, if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. Now I'm really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping in his head. He knew it was too crazy to even consider. Still, if he was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money. Perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB on it doesn't mean that there is a treasure buried out there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feeling of happiness. Or maybe it was destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh? Zero muttered. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised his head. What is it? You want to dig one more hole? 43. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you? Stanley started to ask, but he figured couldn't find the right words. When you moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in my crib and my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song you sing to me. When you sang, it was different though. Zero spoke slowly as if he was searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later, we lived on the street and I'd but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house, not an apartment. I know my room is yellow. It was late afternoon, and as they were resting in the shadow of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they'd have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as seemed safe, and not a second longer. And if there was no treasure, they'd head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they would try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned, the door to rec room squeaks. Now, as he lay on his back trying to save his strength for long days ahead, he wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom had worried that they might be evicted from the apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They easily could become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they would be told he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings that he had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny, but those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and 3 jars of water. They left the broken pieces of jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing to the patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up towards the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You'd already thrown up everything that was in your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on a loose rock, slipped, and fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and the onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out the earth, but slowed him enough so he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled the thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled out some of the thorns on his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected him, like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just about rising over the lake. They started walking directly toward it. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking over the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although he didn't mention it, it had become kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see Mary Lou, but head in the direction he thought was the right direction. The sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it'll lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I just was worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed a very long time, and still never came across Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were headed in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated in sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they finally did take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out the 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last since it couldn't accidentally break. I'm not thirsty, Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking so you will. I'm just drinking so you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together, each watching each other, and poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, if I had to wait in small areas like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still had Jaffy. Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then, one day, she didn't come back, Zero said, his voice suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel where you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was headed straight toward Big Thumb, and I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party. I guess it was 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons tied to it. The kids looked to be about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but the same mother told me, "Go away!" And she told all the other kids to stay away from me, so I never got the piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffy. Did you ever find him? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized now that was how Zero must felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered if Zero ever mentioned his father, why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were headed towards Big Thumb when you saw the boat on your right. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map, then headed that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly until Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As he got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that the sounds traveled in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into the hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone through the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through a cloud, and Stanley felt the rays beating down at him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley in his hole. He waited until he was certain that the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed out of their holes and crept toward the camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled it in his arms instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against one another. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a deep breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered. pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down to adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. So we're stopping at 54. All right? See you guys.